I'm Stephen Matthews, and this is the Masked Amp YouTube channel. If you find these videos informative, interesting or entertaining, please consider liking and following. Norman was a man in his early 50s. He came from a fairly wealthy middle-class family, was educated in a public school, obtained a degree in chemistry and had a high-profile job in a pharmaceutical company for some years before setting up his own consultancy. He married and had one son. The couple divorced after 4 years. He was dissatisfied that custody of his son was given to his wife and embarked on a series of legal challenges which went all the way to the House of Lords. He insisted on conducting his own cases. He continued to challenge court decisions for over 20 years. He had a reputation as a vexatious litigant. In the previous 10 to 15 years, he had been detained under Sec.2 of the Mental Health Act on several occasions. A tentative diagnosis of bipolar affective order was made, but he never spent more than a couple of weeks in hospital. He invariably appealed against detention and represented himself in the tribunal. He was also invariably discharged from detention and would then stop any medication. By the time I became involved with him, Norman had lost all contact with his son. His consultancy had gone into liquidation. He had been evicted from his home for defaulting on his mortgage and was living in a caravan on a residential site paid for by his long-suffering mother, as he refused to claim benefits. One day he went to his bank to request a loan to continue with his endless appeals over custody of his son, who by now was 30 years old. When the bank manager refused, he attempted to remove the computer from the manager's desk in lieu of a loan. He was arrested and detained under Section 2 once again. On admission to the psychiatric ward, he promptly appealed. I was asked to write the social circumstances report. When I interviewed him, he was arrogant and dismissive. That was not in itself evidence of mental illness, but his grandiose delusions about his life and his denial of the dire consequences of his futile litigation over the years, in my view, showed that he was likely to be mentally ill. He had refused medication. In my report, I concluded, it appears likely that Norman has a mental disorder that would be amenable to treatment. However, he has only ever been detained in hospital for short periods of time for assessment, and as far as I can see has never had any treatment which could have a significant impact on mental illness. He is abnormally fixated on past perceived injustices relating to custody of the child of the marriage, to the extent that after all this time he is unable to lead anything approaching a normal life. However, without considerable further assessment, it is impossible to say whether this obsession is delusional and amounts to a treatable mental illness, or is merely an extreme manifestation of despair arising from real injustice. As usual, Norman represented himself at the tribunal. He treated the tribunal as an adversarial court of law and had huge quantities of documents, none of which had relevance to his appeal, but which he attempted to quote from at length. After a few minutes, the chair, who was a judge, was clearly getting irritated and ordered him to stop talking. He asked Norman if he would consider having legal representation. I think, with all respect, Your Honour, that I have more knowledge of legal process than most of the jumped-up barristers that inhabit the Inns of Court, he replied. The judge adjourned the tribunal, insisting that Norman appoint a legal representative. A week later, the tribunal convened. This time, Norman had a solicitor representing him, an eminently reasonable man, whom I had seen representing many patients in tribunals and managers' hearings. His solicitor began to present Norman's case for discharge from detention. But Norman was not prepared to sit silently and instead continually interrupted him, correcting him constantly on minor and irrelevant factual points. The judge became increasingly irritated. Norman's solicitor was looking desperate as he saw any chance of his client being discharged evaporating. Eventually, the judge ordered Norman to be quiet, otherwise he would be asked to leave the tribunal. Norman reluctantly agreed to this, but had to be reminded several times as he found the impulse to challenge every minor point almost too much to suppress. "I put it to you, doctor," he interrupted at one point while the psychiatrist was being interviewed, "that your entire psychiatric edifice is a farrago of nonsense which is designed only to control the minds of those few remaining independent thinkers in this country in which we find ourselves having to live, in an ever-increasing verisimilitude to the terrifying world described in Orwell's book 1984. This was enough for the judge. He asked for Norman to be removed from the room, and the rest of the hearing was conducted in his absence. He was not discharged from his section, and indeed, following a ward discussion in which it was forcibly argued that if it was considered that Norman had a serious mental disorder, then he should be treated for it. And a week later, we detained him under Section 3, and treatment for bipolar affective disorder was commenced. He inevitably appealed again, but within a few weeks, after finally receiving a period of appropriate treatment, he began to emerge as a butterfly emerges from a chrysalis, as a civil, polite and a thoughtful man who could at last see that his behaviour over the last 20 years had been irrational and pointless. He was discharged from detention before his appeal was heard, remained for a further period as an informal patient, and then was discharged to more appropriate accommodation. If you have been, thank you for watching.